Hey everyone, it's Zach with Palantir Research. I've got a couple government contracts here that was not really shown in the mainstream media, but it is available actually for you to research on your own. So even though they weren't announced, these are kind of big contracts to deal with, and I'll show you why, because it really shows the stickiness of Palantir with their government relationships. The first example shows how Palantir continues to expand their services within the same agency over several years, where this year we get a big jump, and this happened just recently. Then the second one, it shows them maxing out the terms of the original contract. Because if you go through a lot of the contract terms when you see them signed in the PR announcement, there's usually an obligation for services at a specified amount of dollars, but also time. But then there are optional ones where the government can either proceed to pay them more money with continued services or just move away from that vendor, which in this case would be Palantir for those contracts. So jumping right in, I'm using the trusty old 2000 looking federal procurement data systems, and that's on fpds.gov. So just looking up Palantir like usual. So the first example with a big jump is for the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, which actually is a sub-department of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So as you can see here from the contract history, they started out with only $22,000 back in 2017, but slowly made their way to almost $800,000 in 2018, then $1.7 million in 2019, all the way to today, where they are clearing $3 million with this agency. Now, the latest contract officially actually only covers up to those last $2 million payments, which both total, if you calculate it exactly to this contract's info, of $4,547,746.65 to the T. And note, these payments are for the time period of January 28, 2022 to January 31, 2024. Now, this additional $950,000 payment taking place on June 26 this year appears to be a continuation of this contract because there is a potential actually end date up to January 31st, 2027. So just based on the consistency of sticking with Palantir for the last 6 years, so that's a long time, I'd say most likely this will continue to trend towards that 2027 end date. Now, the exact dollar amount has already been reached officially for the terms of the contract, as you've seen, so there'll probably be some renegotiation possibly for an additional 2 years or possibly even more to get to that 2027 or closer to it. All I know is that this showcases officially, even though it's a very, very small portion of the government and, of course, for Palantir's revenue, it's only a few $1 million in revenue, of course, and then over 4 quarters, right? That's less than $1 million per quarter. Palantir takes care of their customers, though, no matter how big or small they are, to where it's grown from that tiny $22,000, probably for a trial, of course, to that $3 million for this year. So now think of hitting and missing guidance just by a few $1 million. That can still make a very big difference over several customers, and it really adds up when you start to scale across all these different customers within the government itself. So I'd say not to take these kind of customers for granted because this gives Palantir a use case also within the government that they can share with other departments or agencies as an example. And not to talk down on it, of course, but it's lower stakes situation, right? Managing the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service rather than the Navy, Air Force, or Army, if you know what I mean. So just like to see these kind of deals with the history for us to track as investors. So I'm sure in a couple years, I'll make another video covering how this relationship continues to grow, hopefully. Now, on to the second example here of Palantir's stickiness with the government. This is a great example of them grabbing all the possible dollars laid out for them in a contract. So back in 2021 here, Palantir won an FAA contract to support federal aircraft certification safety operations. Now, in 2023, just this past month, they actually got that last part of this contract here. This was all in June of 2021 when it was announced. And as you can see, they secured a potential, keyword potential, 3-year $18.4 million contract to provide the FAA these software services. Now, for what they're obligated for was the 1-year contract, which was guaranteed and only $5.8 million. But as I said, if they do well, the FAA can so choose to continue purchasing Palantir services, and as we can see from the history, it's there. So hopping over to the contract data, we see just that. First at $5.8 million. Now the $660,000 payment in the side of 2022, I'm not sure what that is. It might have been an expansion of the scope, but either way, we got that $18 million right there. So Palantir won the first optional year on June 22nd, 2022, and then they recently on June 10, 2023, got that additional second optional year. Now, for them to continue doing things, nothing is guaranteed, of course, or if there's a complete build out and that's done. But I think this fully still demonstrates as a great example that Palantir, once they get a chance to showcase their value, it really is sticky for the government. Now, I'm not saying to assume you'll maximize every single contract from the government when there's optional years, but in the negotiation process, Palantir seems to get these clauses because first, they're comfortable with it and they're confident, and second, they think they'll end up using it anyways and not getting cut off early because they know they're providing value. So of course, there's flexibility involved for the customer themselves. So it's always helpful for unforeseen budget cuts, especially for non-military spending related agencies like we saw with the budget freezes. But in the end, if they become so operational because of Palantir and they'd end up spending or wasting more if they actually didn't pay Palantir, then that's the best value proposition when it comes time to determine if you need to take on additional optional continuation of services. So with Q2 earnings coming up, I'm still not expecting a giant jump or beat in revenue, honestly, but if we can continue to maintain these quote-unquote smaller relationships and continue to expand them and just take root, these kind of deals do add up over time because of not only the dollars, but of the building of actual use cases and quantitative value that can be brought to the negotiating table, especially on the government side of deals. And Alex Karp has always warned of the revenues being very lumpy from the government. But if you take a longer term look over multiple years instead of cherry picking year over year stagnation, then you can really start to see the potential from the government side of business. Now, when you take these little ones into account, like the FAA and the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Services, it brings into perspective that there are tiny corners of not only just the federal government, but governments and large organizations across the globe. Like we've seen with Cisco, their AIPCon demo was for Apollo, and specifically for WebEx software updates being deployed across different government regulations and timing of those deployments. So the complications there are already showing. And with FedStart, how many of these smaller agencies can also benefit from Palantir ramping up these potential smaller startup vendors, and they get a chance to actually build up their own relationships and business with the government, which in turn actually does help scale Palantir as well into the little nooks and crannies of government, considering they're going to be the road of the relationship there, and they're the reason why it's there in the first place. There just seems to be a lot of potential when I see little deals like this because they don't get the attention they deserve. I mean, you don't need to announce every single little one, of course, but they still keep the foundation of Palantir's staying power within the government since it cascades down to the hidden underbelly that no one really pays attention to. Plus, with the rising geopolitics, you never really know if Palantir will be called to action and step up for a jumbo military contract, but that's just my speculation. But what are your thoughts on all this? Do you think Palantir can keep up this kind of stickiness in the government? Let me know below, and I'll see you in the next video.